They say the night Jimi Hendrix challenged Bob Dylan, nobody in the room understood what was really about to happen, because the duel wasn't about speed, volume, or ego, but about something far more dangerous, truth. And when Dylan finally responded, it would quietly change the way Hendrix saw music, the way Dylan saw himself, and the way Woodstock would unfold 2 years later. It was late spring 1967, somewhere between midnight and morning in a cramped backstage room above a small Manhattan venue, where cigarette smoke clung to the ceiling like a second atmosphere, and every chair had been claimed by someone who believed they were witnessing history simply by being present. Outside, taxis hissed along wet asphalt. But inside, time felt suspended, as if the room had been carved out of the ordinary world and sealed off for something rare and irreversible. Jimi Hendrix sat cross-legged on an amplifier, his Stratocaster resting lightly against his knee, fingers moving across the strings with idle precision, not playing songs but testing sounds the way a scientist tests elements, while across from him Bob Dylan leaned against a peeling brick wall with his acoustic guitar slung low, hat tilted forward, eyes half-shadowed, his posture so relaxed it almost looked like indifference. Yet anyone who knew Dylan understood that stillness was never emptiness. It was calculation, intuition, a mind working in directions nobody else could see. The room was crowded with musicians, producers, girlfriends, and hangers-on, but conversation kept thinning out as the silence between the two men grew heavier. Hendrix had just finished an explosive set downstairs, bending notes until they sounded like voices breaking through steel, while Dylan had slipped in quietly midway through the show, unnoticed by most, drawn not by fame or spectacle, but by something in Hendrix's playing that felt unsettlingly familiar, like hearing a language he didn't speak but somehow understood. Someone poured bourbon into chipped glasses, someone laughed too loudly, someone whispered, "That's Dylan." But Hendrix didn't look at the crowd. He looked at Dylan, studying him with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for puzzles that refuse to be solved. "You ever get tired of hiding behind words?" Hendrix asked suddenly, his voice calm but edged with something sharper than humor. The room froze, because everyone knew that was not a casual question. Dylan didn't answer right away. He shifted his weight, brushed his fingers across the guitar strings without producing sound, and looked at Hendrix the way a chess player looks at a board where every piece is already in motion. "You ever get tired of shouting when nobody's listening?" Dylan replied softly, and a few people laughed, unsure whether it was a joke, but Hendrix didn't laugh. He smiled slowly, the way someone smiles when they've finally found the right opponent. Hendrix stood up, plugged his guitar into a nearby amp, turned the volume knob just enough to make the air vibrate, and struck a single note that hung in the room like a challenge nobody could pretend not to hear. It wasn't loud, but it was alive, vibrating through bones and walls, and suddenly everyone understood that this was not going to be another backstage jam session. "Let's find out," Hendrix said, stepping closer to Dylan, his voice quiet but undeniable. "You and me. No band, no crowd, no excuses." Dylan looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing not the difficulty of the challenge but the consequences of accepting it, because Dylan had spent his career avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, slipping sideways instead of forward, reinventing himself instead of competing with anyone. But something in Hendrix's tone wasn't arrogance. It was invitation, almost pleading, as if Hendrix wasn't trying to defeat Dylan but to understand him. "All right," Dylan said finally, lifting his acoustic guitar with slow deliberation. "But don't expect what you think you're going to hear," and the way he said it made the room go even quieter, because Dylan had always been most dangerous when he sounded calm. Chairs scraped softly as people leaned forward. Someone turned off a radio in the corner. Even the bartender downstairs seemed to sense that something unusual was happening and stopped playing music through the speakers. Hendrix counted off softly. 1, 2, 3. Not like a performer starting a song, but like someone opening a door that might never close again. And when he played the first phrase, it wasn't flashy or theatrical but raw, stripped of showmanship, a blues line twisted through distortion and feedback, each note bending like metal under heat, his fingers moving faster than thought, yet somehow controlled, as if he were arguing with the guitar rather than playing it. Dylan didn't respond immediately. He listened, eyes closed, head tilted slightly, absorbing the sound not as competition but as language, and for a moment it looked as though he might refuse to play at all, letting Hendrix dominate the space and prove his point. But then Dylan's fingers moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just precise. And instead of chords, he picked single notes, sparse and deliberate, each one landing in the silence between Hendrix's phrases like a sentence spoken after a long pause. The contrast was shocking. Hendrix was thunder, Dylan was distance. Hendrix was electricity, Dylan was memory. Hendrix filled the room, Dylan carved holes in it. And those holes somehow felt heavier than the noise. People stopped whispering, stopped shifting, stopped breathing normally, because they realized they weren't watching a jam session. They were witnessing two completely different philosophies of music colliding in real time, one built on expansion, the other on restraint. Hendrix noticed it too. His playing began to change, his phrases slowing, his volume dipping, his instinctive urge to dominate giving way to something rarer, listening. And as Dylan's notes continued, hesitant but unwavering, Hendrix found himself responding not with louder riffs but with questions, his guitar echoing Dylan's phrases instead of drowning them out. The duel had stopped being a duel without anyone announcing it. It had become a conversation, but not the kind spoken in words, the kind spoken by people who understood that some truths could only be expressed through sound. Dylan's face remained unreadable, yet his hands told another story. He wasn't trying to impress Hendrix, wasn't trying to prove anything, wasn't even trying to win. He was simply refusing to lie with his guitar, and that refusal felt more radical than any solo Hendrix had ever played. When the last note finally faded, it didn't end with applause. It ended with silence so deep it felt physical, as if the room itself needed time to recover from what had just happened. Hendrix lowered his guitar slowly, his expression no longer playful, no longer confident, but thoughtful, almost shaken, while Dylan let his acoustic strings vibrate a second longer before muting them with his palm, his gaze drifting away as though he'd already moved past the moment. "Man," Hendrix said quietly after a long pause, his voice stripped of bravado, "you don't play guitar like a musician." Dylan looked at him. "I study. I play like someone who doesn't trust noise," he replied, and for a brief moment Hendrix laughed, but the laughter carried no mockery, only recognition. Outside, the city kept moving, unaware that something subtle but irreversible had just begun, and inside that smoke-filled room, two men who had nothing to prove to each other had unknowingly set in motion a chain of events that would echo all the way to Woodstock, where the world would finally hear what happened when thunder learned to listen and silence learned to speak. They would later say that nothing visible changed after that night in 1967, that Hendrix walked out laughing and Dylan disappeared into the shadows the way he always did. But the truth was that something invisible had shifted, something that neither man spoke about yet neither could forget, because once you hear a new kind of sound, you can never unhear it. In the weeks that followed, Hendrix found himself playing differently without meaning to, his fingers still fast, still explosive, but now punctuated by strange pauses where silence mattered as much as sound, moments where he would hold a note just long enough to make the audience lean forward instead of backward, and his bandmates noticed it first, glancing at him during rehearsals with puzzled expressions as if they were watching someone rewrite his own instincts in real time. "You're leaving space," Noel Redding said one afternoon, half joking, half confused, and Hendrix shrugged, pretending not to care. But later that night, alone in a hotel room with his guitar resting across his lap, he replayed Dylan's quiet notes in his mind like a riddle that refused to be solved, wondering how something so simple had felt so dangerous. Dylan, meanwhile, did what Dylan always did after shaking something loose in the world. He vanished, retreating from interviews, avoiding clubs, declining invitations, refusing to explain anything to anyone, because explanation would have turned the moment into mythology too soon, and Dylan had always hated mythology when it came too early. Yet even in isolation, he couldn't escape the echo of Hendrix's sound, because Hendrix had done something Dylan had never fully dared to do. He had turned emotion into raw electricity, stripped of metaphor, stripped of irony, stripped of distance, and for the first time, Dylan wondered whether words were becoming a shield rather than a weapon. Months passed, seasons changed, and the music world kept accelerating, rock growing louder, crowds growing bigger, egos growing heavier. until by early 1969 the idea of Woodstock began circulating like a rumor that nobody took seriously at first. Just another ambitious festival dream in an era full of impossible dreams. Yet Hendrix sensed something forming long before the posters went up, because promoters started calling him with voices that sounded less like businessmen and more like prophets, promising a gathering so massive it would feel less like a concert and more like a cultural earthquake. Dylan heard about it too, of course, but he dismissed it with his usual indifference, telling friends he had no interest in playing for crowds that large, no interest in becoming a symbol again, no interest in feeding a generation that expected him to constantly reinvent their beliefs for them. Still, as the months drew closer, Dylan felt something tugging at him, not fame, not money, but unfinished business, because he realized that night with Hendrix had left a question hanging in the air, a question neither of them had answered. What happens when silence and thunder meet in front of the world instead of behind closed doors? Hendrix began rehearsing obsessively, pushing his band through marathon sessions that alternated between chaos and eerie restraint, sometimes stopping mid-song to say, "No, leave it empty there," confusing everyone, because emptiness was not something rock music had ever been taught to value. Meanwhile, Dylan, almost against his will, started experimenting with his guitar again in private, abandoning complex lyrics for stretches of time and focusing instead on tone, touch, and restraint, discovering that the guitar could speak in ways words never could, and the realization frightened him more than it excited him, because Dylan had built his identity on language, and now language was no longer enough. Then, in the spring of 1969, Hendrix and Dylan crossed paths again by accident in a recording studio hallway in Los Angeles, a meeting so casual it almost felt staged by fate. Hendrix was leaving a late-night session, guitar case slung over his shoulder, when he saw Dylan sitting alone on a bench, flipping a coin between his fingers, and for a moment neither man spoke, because both understood that whatever they said would inevitably point back to that night. "You going to Woodstock?" Hendrix asked finally, his tone light, but his eyes serious. Dylan smiled faintly. "Depends," he said. "On what?" Hendrix pressed. Dylan looked at the floor, then back at Hendrix. "On whether it's going to be loud or honest." Hendrix laughed, but the laughter faded quickly. "Sometimes it's both," he said. Dylan didn't answer. He stood up, slung his guitar over his shoulder, and walked away, leaving Hendrix staring down the hallway, as if he had just been handed a challenge without rules or deadlines. As summer approached, rumors spread that Dylan might appear at Woodstock after all, though nobody could confirm it. And most people assumed it was wishful thinking, because Dylan had spent years avoiding precisely that kind of spectacle. Yet Hendrix felt certain something was coming, because he began dreaming about Dylan, not as a rival, but as a mirror, standing across a stage where the crowd had vanished and only sound remained. By the time August arrived, Woodstock had grown far beyond anyone's expectations, transforming from a festival into a pilgrimage, and when Hendrix arrived at the site, he felt an unfamiliar tension, not the anxiety of performing, but the sense that something unscripted was about to unfold, something he could not control with volume or virtuosity. Backstage, surrounded by chaos, mud, exhausted organizers, and musicians half asleep from endless nights of music, Hendrix tuned his guitar slowly, his hands steady but his mind restless, when suddenly someone touched his shoulder and whispered, "You might want to see this." Hendrix turned, confused, and followed the person through a maze of equipment and tents until they reached a small, dimly lit corner near the side of the stage, where a familiar figure stood alone, hat low, acoustic guitar resting against his leg, watching the crowd with an expression that was neither excitement nor fear, but quiet calculation. Dylan had come after all. Hendrix stopped a few feet away, unsure whether to speak, unsure whether the moment belonged to him or to history, and Dylan looked up slowly, meeting his eyes with a faint, almost mischievous smile, the kind that suggested he knew something Hendrix didn't. "Looks crowded," Dylan said softly. Hendrix glanced toward the sea of people stretching beyond the horizon. "Yeah," he replied. "They're waiting for noise." Dylan nodded once. Then maybe it's time they heard something else. And in that instant, Hendrix understood that the duel had never ended. It had only been postponed until the world was watching. Nobody remembers exactly how it was decided who would step on stage first that morning at Woodstock, because by then the festival had dissolved into something beyond schedules and logic. But those who were there swear that when Dylan and Hendrix stood side by side in the half-light behind the stage, neither of them spoke about set lists or contracts or crowds. They spoke only with glances, as if both understood that whatever happened next would not belong to them anymore. The sky was pale with the first hints of dawn, the field still thick with exhausted bodies wrapped in blankets and mud, and the air carried the strange quiet that comes after too much sound, when even chaos seems to hold its breath. Hendrix adjusted the strap of his guitar, feeling the familiar weight of the instrument that had made him famous, while Dylan stood with his acoustic guitar resting lightly in his hands, looking almost detached from the moment, as though he were watching the festival from the outside rather than preparing to step into its center. "You ready?" Hendrix asked quietly. Dylan thought for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "No," he said, "but I'm tired of pretending I am." When Dylan walked onto the stage alone, the reaction was confused at first, cheers rising unevenly, boos from people who had expected thunder instead of whispers, thousands of voices colliding in uncertainty, but Dylan didn't acknowledge any of it. He stepped up to the microphone, closed his eyes, and played a single note, so soft it barely carried past the first rows. Yet slowly, impossibly, the noise of the crowd began to fade as people realized something fragile was happening, something that could be broken by a single shout. Dylan didn't play one of his famous songs, didn't play protest anthems or poetic ballads. Instead, he played something unfamiliar, built from the same quiet, deliberate style Hendrix had heard 2 years earlier. Each note placed carefully into the silence like a question waiting for an answer, and as the melody unfolded, the massive crowd, hundreds of thousands of people who had come expecting rebellion and volume, found themselves leaning forward, listening not to spectacle but to vulnerability. Then, without announcement, Hendrix stepped onto the stage behind Dylan, and the moment he plugged in his guitar, the crowd erupted, believing the storm was finally arriving. But Hendrix didn't unleash it. Instead, he waited, listening to Dylan's fragile melody, and when he finally played, he didn't overpower it. He followed it, weaving electric notes around Dylan's acoustic whispers like lightning tracing the outline of a shadow. What happened next was not a duel and not a performance. It was something rarer, almost frightening in its honesty, because Hendrix let go of his need to dominate and Dylan let go of his need to hide, and together they created a sound that felt less like music and more like revelation, electric and acoustic, thunder and silence, ego and humility, dissolving into something neither man could have created alone. Some people in the crowd didn't understand it. Some walked away, disappointed that the music wasn't louder, faster, or more chaotic, but many stayed frozen, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would never happen again, a moment when two legends stopped competing with the world and started speaking to it. When the final note faded, there was no immediate roar of applause, only a long, stunned silence, as if the audience needed time to process what had just been taken from them and given back transformed. And then the cheering came, not wild and reckless but deep and sustained, rising like a wave that carried more awe than excitement. Hendrix looked at Dylan, and for the first time, his expression wasn't triumphant or playful, it was grateful. Dylan looked back, gave a small nod, and stepped away from the microphone without a word, disappearing into the backstage shadows the same way he always had, leaving Hendrix alone under the rising sun with a crowd that no longer knew what kind of music it wanted but knew it had just heard something true. Years later, critics would argue about that morning, some calling it a failed experiment, others calling it the birth of a new kind of rock, but Hendrix would never describe it in interviews except once, when a journalist asked him who won the guitar duel with Bob Dylan, and Hendrix paused for a long time before answering. There was never a duel. There was just a moment when we both stopped lying. While Dylan, asked the same question years later, simply said, "He taught me that sometimes the loudest thing you can do is listen." And somewhere between those two sentences lies the real ending of the story. Not in applause, not in fame, not in legends, but in the quiet truth that for one dawn at Woodstock, thunder learned to follow silence, silence learned to trust thunder, and the world, without fully understanding it, heard music the way it had never heard it before, and maybe never would again.